We're beginning Siman Tov Reish Ayin Hey. We already discussed last session the source from the Gemara of this Siman. Halakha Oisa Mitzvah versus Hanacha Oisa Mitzvah is the act in lighting the menorah or in the placement of the menorah when you place it down. We're going to learn more about exactly what that means and the very practical ramifications that this halacha has. The Torah begins the Siman by saying Hilchas. The bottom line halacha is the Gemara itself said, which we learned last session in Shabbos and Chav Gimel, teaches us that Hadlaka is always a mitzvah. That lighting the menorah is the mitzvah, v'loy hanacha, not the placement of the menorah. Meaning, she'im haisa munachas b'makoymo sh'loy l'shem mitzvahs Chanukah madlika sham. V'in tzorech lahasiro v'lahanichoy l'shem mitzvahs Chanukah. One practical difference, or what we call a nafkamina, whether you hold the Hadlaka is a mitzvah or hanacha is a mitzvah, is she'im. That let's say Shim Haisa Munachas b'makom, let's say the menorah was placed in a certain location. It was already there beforehand, before Chanukah. Shaloi l'shem mitzvahs Chanukah. It was there not for Chanukah per se. Manicho madlika sham. You should light it over there. V'in sorech lahasiro v'lahanicho l'sham. You don't need to now remove it, aka pick it up and then place it again over there l'shem mitzvahs Chanukah for the sake of the mitzvah of Chanukah. It's not an idea that it needs to be placed, physically placed, the menorah for Chanukah. Rather, that it needs to be lit in honor of Chanukah. Therefore, as the Gemara says, therefore, if you had a pre-existing flame, if you had something that was already lit beforehand, for example, let's say you lit the menorah on night 1, and it still remained aflame by the time night 2 came along. It doesn't matter. You would have to extinguish it and then rekindle it. But the idea is that you would not need to pick it up and then place it back down. The Torah then continues to write, you need to light it in the place where it was placed. You need to light the menorah in a location where it was. Let's say, for example, you lit the menorah inside and then you removed it outside. Well, yatsa, you would not fulfill your obligation. So from over here, we see the important idea of if a menorah was lit inside and you removed it outside, that would not be good, because the halacha is that where you light the menorah, it needs to stay there. As we're learning, halakha oisa mitzvah means it needs to be lit in a location, remain in that location, and in a way that there's enough oil that will last until a half hour after when 3 stars come out. Now, what's the problem of moving it? Why can't you light a menorah in one location, then move it somewhere else? So the Torah relates what it says in the Gemara, which we learned already last session. Lo yotza sha'aroy omer l'sarchu hu madlika. Someone who sees the menorah will say, you lit it for your own needs. L'sarchu hu denakit la. The Gemara says. Similarly, if you light it and you hold the menorah in your hand the entire time in its place, you would not fulfill your obligation, because someone who sees it says that he did it for his own needs. He just lit it for his own needs, just using it for light so that he could see where to go, whatever it is. This is actually where it comes from. Last time I wasn't sure where this Sfas Emes comes from. He said a deeper idea: if you're just holding it, you didn't do anything, because a person can't be stationary. A toughest vayimid that if you were holding it and you were just standing there, loss of a lo klum, the Gemara says you were just holding it, you didn't do anything. Because when it comes to our service of Hashem, we can't be stagnant. We can't be stationary. We have to keep ascending and growing from one level to another. And similarly, the Sfas Emes says that on Chanukah, we have to grow from the menorah. If we're not growing from that experience, the loss of a lo klum, you miss the boat of what menorah is about. Siv Beis, the Torah writes, since the main mitzvah is At the time when you're actually lighting, there needs to be enough oil in the that it will be able to last before you light it, not after. So the idea is that you can't have enough oil that it will last for 4 minutes. You light it and then you add more oil. That doesn't work that way. The halacha of halakha isa mitzvah teaches us that there has to be enough oil that it would last for the proper duration of time. The Beis Yosef specifies even though we hold halakha isa mitzvah, nevertheless you need to light it, the menorah, in a place where it's going to be placed. There's a fascinating Beis Yosef over here, and many quote this Mahari Avuhav, as you will continue to see, about a very relevant scenario which happened in a shul hundreds of years ago. Even though it happened such a long time ago, it still nevertheless is incredibly applicable for today's day and age as well. Matzosi Kosev b'shem Mahari Avuhav Zal. Kosev ben Emuke Yosef ki pam achas roa bebeis hakneses shehadliku haneiros bekli shayimadlikin kol hashana lahayir. One time, they saw that they were lighting the menorah, and they were in shul and using a type of vessel. He calls it a kli. We'll call this a type of chandelier. Chandelier in the middle of the room. Keep in mind, they didn't have electricity. So their chandeliers, it would be lit, and it would just be lit with actual flame. So the idea is that this chandelier was in the shul, and it was lit up, and it was providing light. But they wanted to know, could they use this as a menorah? And they said, yeah, we're going to light it and have in mind it's going to count as a menorah. Now, there was a type of a pulley system over here. How would they light it very high? They didn't necessarily get a ladder every single time. Rather, what they did is they had a rope. And remember, they didn't have wires. It wasn't hooked up to electricity. They had a rope, and they would pull it like a pulley system. They would pull the rope, and then they would put it around a type of like a screw, or what do you call those things at a port when you dock a ship? Those things that you tie the rope on so the ship doesn't move. I don't know the names of those. If anyone knows, let me know. So they would tie it around something like that, and the whole chandelier would get picked up because of the rope that they were pulling a miyuchad lo kol hashana. Umicha bi'adamadlik shlo yasekin. Now some people, they were rebuking the person who lit this, and they said, you can't do this. Sha'af al pi sheshamu ha'oimdim bebeis hakneses habracha shel Chanukah b'shas hadloko, because even though that the people in the shul, they heard the bracha of Chanukah at the time when you were lighting, even though everyone answered amen to the bracha, we got one problem. Mikol makom haroya shelo hayasham ba'iso shah yorm l'sarcha hu shedliko. Someone who saw what was going on, who wasn't there at the time of when the brachos were recited on the menorah, is going to say it was being used for your own need. In other words, you could come along and say, wait a second, everyone in shul was there, everyone saw that it was being lit for a menorah, and everyone saw the brachos, so why can't they just lift the thing up after? The answer is, if someone walks in late. It could very well be that someone's going to walk in not during the brachos, and he's going to say, oh, they're just lighting this menorah for their own needs. That's a major halachic issue. And therefore, siva shelo yagbihenu elish yanichen lamat v'pachos me'atzara. And therefore, he commanded and said, don't pick it up. Rather, you should leave it below 10. You should leave it even below 10 tvachim, below 30 inches. Still, this is questionable because you're benefiting from the light. You're using it. You're benefiting from the menorah. And since the rest of the year they're frequently they're used to benefiting from this light, even though it's not in its place. Kevan she'ein ner b'makom ner Chanukah, yefshar shelo yishtamesh ner Chanukah la'imdim shel makom haner. Some people are going to benefit from this. And therefore, you should come up with a different system and don't use this type of chandelier system. So you clearly see from the Nemuki Yosef, from the Mahari Avuhav, that they were not happy with this practice that was done with the chandelier in their shul. Venerally, says the Beis Yosef, says Rabbi Yosef Cairo, it appears to me, since the whole idea of having a menorah in shul is only a custom, which they customarily practiced, which we'll have to learn more about in Siman Tov Reish Ayin Aleph. And the proof is in the pudding. We're not concerned that it has to be in front of the actual door. Rather, it could be in front of the Aron Kodesh. So the idea is that really when the Gemara talks about lighting the menorah, it's talking about an outside. You do it outside. Or you light the menorah by your door, etc. Shul, you don't need to. Why? Because it's a mere custom. Im ledaktik bazeh. Kach mishuma nechnatzim yoitzin. Says the Beis Yosef, I'm going to be lenient. Don't worry about the people that are coming in late. It's fine. You could light the chandelier and you could even lift it up after with your rope. Vote and furthermore, shafilu babayis ein anu madlikin. Even in the house, we do not light achshav. Elam ibnei, rather we do it because of the bnei bayis, the people of the house. In other words, nowadays, why do we light? It used to be that the Persumei Nisa was more outside, more for the passerbyers, the pedestrians, the people who are outside. Nowadays, which we have to figure out in another time, not now, not the simon, but why exactly it changed the halacha that you should light inside, and in which places maybe would it not change, and could you still light outside? We're gonna have to learn about that. Mim kain, consequently, if that's so, lefize in lachush laoivrim v'shavim. You don't need to worry about passerbyers kol kach so much so. The kosher came by second says certainly this applies in a shul shari kol abayim l'sham yoidim, because everyone who's going to the shul knows shelo aneres heim shel Chanukah. This is the menorah. These are the candles for Chanukah. V'od furthermore hayanir loimer shemaacher shekfar hedlikam b'makom she'ino roi dahavi leikik hafta the ein zakul. If you're lighting in a place that isn't fit to be lit, it's as if it was extinguished and you don't need to relight it. This Hakan Lashoino actually might be the Nemuka Yosef commenting on the Mahari Avuv. Or the Mahari Avuv, commenting on the Menucha Yosef. Not the Beis Yosef. That's what to look into there. This is a fascinating situation over here. Any questions or comments on this?
So at the end of the day, at the end of the day, he was makel and allowed them to use it.
Yeah, that's at the end of the day there were different opinions. But at the end of the day, there's a machlokes on this, and we'll have to see, bottom line halacha, how we're going to come out with this case. It's more theoretical because we don't have these types of chandeliers really anymore.
Where is it? Oh, all right. Another question.
The Torah concludes this simon by saying, "V'lo yadli ken acher shot v'katan." A chashav shouldn't light the menorah. Someone who's deaf, mentally challenged, or a minor. And afal pisha he haisa b'neis shafi haisa b'neis v'chayav. Woman could light the menorah; she's part of the miracle and is obligated in it. That's a whole discussion. We're going to come back to this a lot more, especially for husbands there. Beis Yosef says, "Mi ukotz ba'aleter de'im hegia l'chinach motor v'akol talud b'minhag." Depends on the age of this minor. If he reached the age of education, then says the Itter, he can certainly light. It's permissible for him to do so, and everything depends on the custom of that place. or just in general, the custom. This is the Torah. Pretty much straightforward. We didn't miss anything. The earlier Beis Yosef, he just quotes the Gemara, which we already saw inside. The source of putting enough oil in before is the rush. So all the Beis Yosef says. The Bach goes into some lamdas on the Gemara. I'm going to start the Shulchan Aruch now. The Shulchan Aruch opens up the simon by saying, Halakha is a mitzvah. The lighting, when it comes to the mitzvah menorah, halakha is a mitzvah. The lighting is the mitzvah. V'loy hanacha, not the placement. Shimhaisa munachas b'makoyma. If the menorah was placed in its place, shaloi l'shem mitzvah Chanukah, it was placed there not for the sake of the mitzvah of Chanukah. If it was placed there not for the sake of Chanukah, madlika sham, you just light it over there. You don't need to remove it and then replace it, relocate it for the sake of the mitzvah of Chanukah. If you hold hanacha is a mitzvah, you need to pick the whole menorah up and then put it back down. Fikach, therefore, as we already learned numerous times in the Gemara and the Torah, if you had something that was lit the entire day, like a type of lantern, from already before Shabbos, the Shulchan Aruch adds the words mitzvah Chanukah. It was lit for the sake of Chanukah. This we saw was actually a machloikis between Rashi and Tosfos. L'moitzi Shabbos, after Shabbos, mechave, you extinguish it, umadlika l'shem mitzvah, and you should relight it for the sake of a mitzvah. If we just pull up in the Gemara that we learned last session, the Shulchan Aruch is going like Rashi. You lit this menorah before Shabbos for the sake of Chanukah. According to Tosfos, it was opposite. You lit this menorah in honor of Shabbos. So machlekes Rashi Tosfos. So the Shulchan Aruch is going to be going like Rashi over here. You lit the menorah for Chanukah. Now you need to extinguish it and then rekindle it after Shabbos. Mikol Makom, says the Shulchan Aruch in the continuation. Sarich she'ad likenu b'makom hanachasa. You need to light it in the menorah in a place where it was placed. She'im hedlika b'fnim v'hoitziu lachutz. If you lit it inside and then you removed it outside, lo yotza, you would not fulfill your obligation. Shaharoyo omer, because someone who looks at it will say, l'sorcho hu madlika, you lit it for your own needs. V'chein, and similarly, if you lit it and then you held it in your hand in its place, you wouldn't fulfill your obligation. Someone who's going to see you is going to say you just lit it for your own needs. That's why you're holding it. For your own needs, so you have light. The Magen Avram opens up this simon, and his commentary to this simon in a very concise manner. The Magen Avram only has 2 words. And he says, Ravusa Nakat. This which the Shulchan Aruch said that the menorah was lit before Shabbos. When it was lit before Shabbos, it was lit for the sake of Hanukkah. And we would have potentially thought that 25 hours later we could use that for Hanukkah. That's why the halacha, the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch needs to teach us that we cannot. We would have to extinguish it and then rekindle it. Says the Magen Avram, this is a Ravusa Nakat. It's a chiddush. It's a tremendous insight. Let me ask you a question. What's the insight to this? Why is it such a chiddush? What is so insightful about this halacha?
Mm. So what?
The Magen Avram is saying, listen up, fellas. This is a tremendous insight. What's the insight? The Machasis shekel on those two words has 200 words. The job of the Machasis shekel over here, his unofficial job and goal of this Magen Avram is to try to explain these two words. What is so insightful about this? So the Magen Avram begins by quoting the Gemara, which we already learned, quoting Rashi Tosfos, which we already learned last session. And he says, you clearly see from Tosfos that it's better if the menorah was originally lit for Hanukkah. Because let's say we're going to say Hanacha Oisa mitzvah. The placing of the menorah is the mitzvah. So if you originally lit the menorah for Hanukkah, according to the idea, if we're going to hold Hanacha Oisa mitzvah, which we don't, placing it as a mitzvah, you don't need to extinguish it. Because it won't be worse than if the menorah was lit by a chereshot of a cotton. Someone who was deaf, mentally challenged, or minor. However, if the menorah was originally lit not for Hanukkah, even if we would say Hanacha is a mitzvah, placing it as a mitzvah, you need to extinguish it. Because based on what we learned from Tosfos last session, this is worse than if a chereshot or cotton lit it. If a menorah was lit before Shabbos and you want to use it 25 hours later, 26 hours later, and you hold Hanacha is a mitzvah, placing it as the mitzvah, you certainly need to extinguish it and then relight it, pick it up, also put it down. Because what we learned from Tosfos is if someone who is deaf, mentally challenged, or minor lit it, at least they lit it for the sake of Hanukkah. At least they lit it. At least they lit the menorah at a time when you're allowed to light the menorah and fulfill your obligation with it. And for the sake of Hanukkah. As opposed to this case of when you lit it Erev Shabbos. So that kind of review of Tosfos. Says the Machasis shekel, now we can tie it back into the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram said that when the Shulchan Aruch said, if you lit it before Shabbos for the sake of Hanukkah, Hu Ravusa, Naka Ravusa, the Magen Avram says. Why is that such a chiddush? What's so insightful about that? Says the Machasis shekel, and here we're going to pick it up from the Machasis shekel inside. This is where he adds his own words. Loi mi baye goes without saying im hudloko shaloi l'shem ner Chanukah. It goes without saying if this menorah was lit before Shabbos, not for the sake of Chanukah. Even if we would say placing it as the mitzvah hanachois mitzvah, you would still need to extinguish it and then relight it. Rather, even if this menorah was lit for the sake of Chanukah, in which case the ihavi kaimalon hanacha is a mitzvah lo hayasarch l'chvaiso. In which case, if we would hold that placing it as the mitzvah, you would not need to extinguish it. because it was lit for the sake of Hanukkah, it was placed for the sake of Hanukkah, albeit that it was 26 hours before it was supposed to be lit, but it was placed for the sake of Hanukkah and lit for the sake of Hanukkah. So we would have thought maybe it would be okay. No, mikol makom kevin the kaimalan hadloko is a mitzvah sarch l'chvaisa. Since we hold that lighting is the mitzvah, that's why you need to extinguish it. So in other words, the Machasis HaShekel is explaining that the inside of the Magen Avram, the Chiddush of the Magen Avram is that this case you would need to extinguish and then relight it because we hold Halakha mitzvah. Even if you lit the menorah on the eve of Shabbos before Shabbos for the sake of Chanukah, would still not be good because it's Halakha mitzvah. Lighting it is a mitzvah. It needs to be lit at the proper time. Questions, comments?
Mm. Yeah.
Nope.
The next Magen Avram says in Beis, I am Beis Yosef. יש ימים שבנרות בית הכנסת מותר להדליקה ממקום זה ולהניחה ממקום אחר מכל מקום יש זר לכאכיל. So the psak of the Magen Avram rules based on the Beis Yosef that we just learned 10 minutes ago. Mikol makom yesh zar lechachila. Nevertheless, you should be careful, preferably. You should be careful not to take a menorah, the one in shul, and move it from one location to another. So he learns that b'di'evet it would be fine. The next Magen Avram says, I don't understand. We have a case over here of hedlika b'fnim v'hoitzio lachutz. You lit the menorah inside, and then you brought it outside. Shulchan Aruch says, the Gemara says, you wouldn't fulfill your obligation, sha'aroyim or l'sarchu hu madlika. Someone who's going to see you Marzai, and he's going to think, oh, you just lit that for your own personal use, so you could benefit from it. Yes, the Magen Avram in Gimel quoting a Bach in Hilchos Sukkah. Wait a second. Isn't the reason why you can't move it is Hadlaka is a mitzvah? The lighting it is a mitzvah and it needs to remain there? Why are you coming on to the second reason? Answers the Magen Avram, even us that we light inside. We light inside nowadays. If you put it outside, you still wouldn't fulfill your obligation because someone is going to say that you're just lighting it for your own needs. The Pri Megadim in the Eshel of Ram comments on this Magen Avram about relocating the menorah in the shul. And he says, L'chatchila, certainly, preferably, you should be careful. Vadein latalta ner Chanukah. Don't move the menorah at all. Leave them for at least a half hour in a place where you lit them. Magen Avram then continues, the Eshel Avram, the Pri Megadim, then continues and says, that story that you saw that from the Beis Yosef, the Mahdi Avuhav. Oh, whoops. I made a mistake. Before I said that the Bach was in Hilchos Sukkah. Sorry, it was no, it was not in Hilchos Sukkah. It's on page Tafresh Kafches. Sorry, not in Hilchos Sukkah. I made a mistake. Sorry. This Mahari Avuav that we saw quoted in the Beis Yosef, the case with the chandelier in the shul. He says the Darchei Moshe also relates this. And he says there are different texts and versions of this story. And he says one text there was a mistake that was made about this, and he says leichter. That's why I called it a chandelier, because of this text of that the Pri Megadim quotes. Leichter is like a chandelier. So it was suspended, it was hanging in the air like our lights nowadays, but it was through a rope. So, they were pulling it up, down with the menorah. And he said, in la king, don't do it. Someone came in, he's going to see. Bafim Yom Pachas Masaret Tvachim, Shem Yishtamish Bo. Might come to use it. Rahavi Kikavso, and it's like it's extinguished. It's no good. So be careful about that. The Lavush of Mordechai Yafa says, Ein mitzvah ba'albaka. Why is the mitzvah menorah specifically the lighting? Sheba nikar pirsum hanes. It's recognizable that publicizing the miracle this way. This is a way to make that recognizable. I'll have to maybe come back to that. That is the Lavush. The Aruch HaShulchan says, this is actually an interesting oath, this whole oath Dalit from what I remember. You know, even though halakha is a mitzvah, you can't light at one place and then relocate it. You have to leave it there for at least half an hour. If it happened that you lit it, that it should remain over here in one place, and then afterwards, because of a certain reason, you relocate it to another place, you'd still fulfill your obligation. Then he goes into the shul. Maybe you could be more lenient. Quotes the Magen Avraham. You should be careful, preferably. Then he says, you're obligated to put oil in there enough that it will last the proper amount of time. If you made a bracha on a little bit of oil, you lit the menorah, and then afterwards you added oil. Lo yatsa yedei chayvasa. You would not fulfill your obligation, says the Aruch HaShulchan, de be'inon shir b'shas hadlaka. Kevan da halaka is a mitzvah upashidhu. He says you would not even fulfill your obligation if you added more after. It has to be halaka is a mitzvah, aka it has to last 30 minutes after when 3 stars come out after Seis Chavim. That which the Beis Yosef writes about in Siv Beis. And he says that this opinion is only a yesh mishoimer. Someone says this halacha. Darcho b'Shulchan Aruch kishaloi hizkir din zerak b'poisek echad. It's the way of the Shulchan Aruch to say yesh mishoimer. There are those that say, and it could just be one person that says it. That's not saying that we don't hold like that opinion or that others argue on it. It's just that sometimes if only one person said that halacha, then the Beis Yosef says, oh, there are those who say it, but it doesn't mean that we don't hold that way. We certainly do. However, let's say you made the brachos on the menorah and you didn't start lighting the menorah yet. And then you added more oil, enough that it could last. You're like, oh my gosh, there's only a few minutes worth of oil. You would fulfill your obligation, says the Aruch HaShulchan. So that nuance I thought was a fascinating halacha, which isn't really brought down so much. That what you have to put enough oil in there that it will last. If you didn't, you wouldn't fulfill your obligation. However, if b'diavad post facto you added it in between when you recited the brachos and when you actually lit the menorah, you would fulfill your obligation. I thought that was fascinating halacha to share. Any questions, comments, or anything we did today whatsoever?
Again, he says that as you said the bracha and before you lit, you added it.
Correct. That's fine.
It's not a hefsek, okay?
It's a hefsek lechatchila.
Hila,
However,
right.
b'diavad, it's sarchi menorah. It's and therefore it's fine, and it would still be good. You could still do it. You should do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Fascinating halacha to end with something incredibly not so relevant, but it could happen, but interesting to think about that we could take with us through our day.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Mitzvah Hashem. Tomorrow we will continue virtually.
Okay.
And then Wednesday back in person. Yeah.
Sounds good. All
All
right,
right. Have a
sure.
wonderful day. All right, Brooklyn.